Night blankets the valley. Suddenly red flames erupt from the south, devouring the wooden barn. Thick smoke coils into the black sky. Horses scream in panic through the dark. A figure charges straight into the inferno, hauling a terrified animal out by pure force. Water from the well is flung again and again. Walls crack and spit sparks. Heat scorches skin raw. They work side by side in urgent silence, fighting to save what's left before everything turns to ash. But this fire is no accident. A lantern hangs on a rope in the hayloft, burning through on purpose, timed for the exact hour the house sleeps. Rowena Ashcroft had scrubbed this same pot 40 times since spring. She knew its shape by touch now. The dent on the left side, where it had slipped off the stove 3 winters back. The way the handle heated faster than a body expected, so you learned to grab it with a rag even when you told yourself you wouldn't need to. Outside the kitchen window, her sister was laughing. That laugh, high and bright and practiced like a bell somebody had trained to ring on command. Odessa stood in the yard in her blue calico, the one with the lace collar their mother had sewn special, and 3 young men from town were arranged around her like she was the only thing worth looking at in the whole county. Which Rowena supposed she was. The water had gone cold around her hands. She hadn't noticed. Rowena, her mother's voice, from the table, where she was kneading bread, with the kind of force that suggested the dough had personally wronged her. Those dishes aren't going to finish themselves. No, ma'am. She went back to scrubbing. Because that was what she did. Because somebody had to, and it was never going to be Odessa, and it was never going to be their mother, who had raised one beautiful daughter, and one useful one, and never once confused which was which. 23 years old, standing at a window, watching her life happen to somebody else. The door banged open, and Odessa swept in the way she swept, into every room, skirts first, smile second, the whole house rearranging itself around her, without anyone deciding to let it. Did you see Thomas Whitfield's face? She spun once just because she could. I thought the poor boy might faint dead away. I saw. You could try it sometime. Smiling. Odessa plucked an apple from the bowl and bit into it, unbothered, unhurried. A girl who had never once had to wonder if a room wanted her in it. It wouldn't kill you, Ro. Their mother made a small sound of agreement, without looking up, from the dough. Rowena kept scrubbing, because there was nothing to say to that, because she tried the smiling once, years back, and it had gotten her nothing, but Odessa's raised eyebrow, and her mother's quiet correction. Not like that, dear, you'll frighten the horses, and so she'd stopped trying, and started scrubbing instead, and scrubbing at least had never once laughed at her. That evening the letter came. Her father brought it in from town folded twice, the paper gone soft at the creases, from however many hands had carried it before his. He set it on the table without a word, and went to hang his coat, and Odessa snatched it up, before anyone else could so much as breathe. She read it once. Her face did something complicated. She read it again. Well, their mother had stopped kneading. It's him. Odessa's voice had gone strange. Then, the rancher. He says, she stopped, started again. He says the money's coming, passage money. He says he'll expect me by the 2nd week of the month. Silence settled over the kitchen like dust. Because this had been going on for 3 months now. A newspaper advertisement Odessa had answered on a lark, the way she answered most things, for the thrill of it, for something to talk about at church, that the other girls hadn't done. Rancher seeks wife. Wyoming Territory. Must be capable and willing to travel. She'd written back with her prettiest handwriting, and her prettiest lies about how capable she was, and somewhere out west a man named Thaddeus Kane had believed every word of it. $80, their father said. When the money arrived 4 days later in an envelope thick enough to make his hands shake just holding it. For passage and wedding expenses. He looked at the sum like a man looking at rain, after a season of drought. $80. That was more than the farm had cleared in a year. Everyone in the room understood that without anyone saying it. You'll go then. He said it to Odessa like it was already decided because in his mind it already was. But Odessa had gone very pale. She waited until the money was spent, half toward the debt on the seed corn, half toward things Rowena would later understand were never coming back, before she said what she'd apparently known all along, and hadn't found the courage to say sooner. "I can't." 2 words. The whole house went still around them. "I can't go, Papa." Her voice cracked, and for once it didn't sound performed. "I can't marry a stranger in the territories. She looked at their mother, then away, quick, guilty. "There's someone else." Came out in pieces after that. A name Rowena hadn't heard before, Harlan Pruitt, the banker's son, from 2 towns over, a boy with soft hands, and a family with money enough that their father's eyes had gone bright and hungry the moment the name was spoken. Odessa had been meeting him in secret since spring. Letters. A promise whispered somewhere their mother hadn't been watching. She'd answered the rancher's advertisement before any of that started, and then Harlan had happened, and she hadn't known how to unwrite a letter already sent. "You'll write to him," their father said. His voice had gone flat and dangerous. "Tell him there's been a mistake." "The money's spent, Papa." Odessa's tears were real now, or real enough. "We can't send it back. We don't have it." "Then what in God's name do you expect me to do?" Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer, because a man out in Wyoming Territory was expecting a bride by the 2nd week of the month, and the bride he was expecting had already given her heart to someone else 2 counties away, and the money that had bought her passage was gone into the ground with the seed corn. Rowena stood at the sink, with her hands in cold water, watching her family come apart at the table, and felt the particular stillness that comes right before something terrible decides to happen to you. She should have known. Looking back on it later, she would understand she'd known the moment her father's eyes moved to her and stopped. Rowena. Just her name. That was all it took. No. She said it, before she'd even fully understood the shape of what she was refusing. "Papa, no. He's expecting a bride." Her father stood, and the chair scraped back hard enough to make Odessa flinch. "He's paid for a bride. He doesn't know what she looks like. He's never laid eyes on either one of you. Then send him a letter. Tell him the truth." The truth. Her father's laugh had no humor in it at all. "The truth is we owe on this farm more than we'll clear in 2 years, and that $80 is already spent, and if we don't send somebody west by the 2nd week of the month, that man has every right to come looking for his money with the law behind him. You want to explain to a judge where it went." Rowena's throat had gone dry. "So send me instead. Is that it? Send the one nobody will miss." "Rowena." Her mother weakly from the table. "It's true, isn't it?" She turned on her mother, and something in her chest, that had been quiet for 23 years, finally cracked open. "Say it's not true. Go on. Tell me you'd have thought twice, if it were Odessa standing here instead of me." Nobody said anything, which was its own kind of answer, because that was the thing about being the useful daughter. You learned early that useful and wanted were not the same word, no matter how many times people tried to tell you they were. Useful meant the dishes got done. Useful meant the hens got fed, and the garden got weeded, and the mending got mended. Useful did not mean anyone would fight to keep you home. "You're strong," her father said, and it was meant as comfort. She understood that even then, even furious, even with her whole world tilting sideways under her feet. Practical. You'll manage a household better than your sister ever could. You'll have land of your own instead of growing old in this kitchen. And if I say no, then we lose the farm. He said it simply, like a fact of weather. And your mother goes to live with her sister in Ohio, and I don't know what becomes of the rest of us. And none of that changes what that man out west is owed. The kitchen had gone very quiet. Rowena looked at her mother's face, worn thin with worry even on ordinary days. She looked at Odessa, still crying, still beautiful even crying, already halfway to forgiven for the mess she'd made, because forgiveness came easy to people the world had decided to love on sight. She looked at the pot she'd been scrubbing an hour before, sitting forgotten in the cold water, its dent still there, still hers to know by touch. And she understood, in the particular way a person understands something they've always half known, that this had never really been a question at all. It had only felt like one. Fine. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'll go. Her father let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. You'll tell him there was a mix-up. That your sister took ill. That you're the elder, and you've come to honor the arrangement in her place. You want me to lie to him. I want you to survive, Rowena. For a moment, just a moment, something almost like tenderness crossed his face. There's no shame in that. She didn't answer. She picked the pot back up out of the cold water and finished scrubbing it because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking, and because some habits outlast even the day your whole life gets sold out from under you. The 3 days before she left passed in a blur of preparation that felt, to Rowena, considerably more like a funeral than anything resembling a wedding. Her mother let out the hem on one of Odessa's old dresses, not the good one. Odessa had made very clear she meant to keep that for herself, some future occasion Rowena preferred not to imagine. A plain gray-green wool that had never once looked good on anybody and wasn't about to start now. It hung on Rowena's taller frame, with none of the softness it had carried on her sister. You'll need to take it in at the waist, her mother said around a mouthful of pins, kneeling at Rowena's feet like she was fitting a stranger. You've gone thinner this year. Have I? Rowena. A warning mild. Don't start. She didn't start. She stood still as a fence post and let herself be pinned and measured and altered into a shape that would pass, and somewhere in the middle of it she stopped feeling anything at all, which was, she decided, probably a mercy. Odessa hovered near the doorway most of those 3 days, guilt and relief taking turns on her pretty face. You'll write to me, she said, the night before Rowena left, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed they'd shared, as children before the house got too crowded, and they got too old to share it comfortably. Tell me everything, what the territory looks like, what he's like. Will you write back? Of course I will. You didn't write back to him. Rowena said it without heat, just a fact laid down plain between them. 3 months of letters, and the moment it got real, you stopped answering. Odessa's face crumpled. That's not fair. No, Rowena agreed. It isn't. None of this is fair. But I don't get to say that and have it change anything, do I? You get to cry and be forgiven. I get to go. I never asked you to do this. No. Rowena looked at her sister in the candlelight, the golden hair, the tear-bright eyes, the face that had been getting people to forgive her since the day she was born. You didn't ask. You just made it necessary. There's a difference, Dessa, even if nobody in this house has ever once made you learn it. Her sister didn't answer that. There wasn't really an answer to give. Rowena packed by candlelight after Odessa left the room. 2 work dresses. The altered gray-green one, folded on top. Her grandmother's Sunday dress, 20 years out of fashion, and smelling faintly of the cedar chest it had lived in. A hairbrush with a cracked handle. A small book of pressed wildflowers she'd kept since she was 12, foolish and sentimental, and hers, the one thing in the trunk that belonged to nobody's plan but her own. At the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, she placed the letter itself. She'd read it 11 times already. She would read it 11 more before the week was out. I am a rancher with land outside a good creek in Wyoming Territory, raising cattle. I am 33 years of age, in good health, and in need of a wife to manage the household and provide companionship. If terms are agreeable, I will send passage. No flourishes, no pretty language dressed up to hide what it was. Just a man stating plainly what he wanted, and what he'd pay for it, and something about that plainness had settled strangely in Rowena's chest the first time Odessa read it aloud, laughing months ago, before any of this was real. Companionship, not love, not romance. He hadn't promised either. At least he hadn't lied. She was 3 days from stepping off a stagecoach into the life of a man who had paid good money for a bride he'd never seen, and the woman climbing down to meet him would not be the one he thought he'd bought. The deception sat in her stomach like something spoiled. Saturday came gray and threatening rain. the sky the color of an old bruise. Rowena stood in the yard in the altered dress, feeling it pull wrong at the shoulders no amount of pinning had quite fixed, while her mother fussed with a bonnet that wouldn't sit right no matter how many times she adjusted it. There. Her mother stepped back, studied her. You look fine, Rowena. Fine. Not lovely. Not beautiful. Fine, the way a fence was fine. The way a well-built wagon was fine, sound, serviceable, nothing anyone would stop to admire. The word fit. That was the trouble with it. Her father loaded her trunk onto the wagon that would carry her to the depot, and Rowena stood in the yard memorizing details she'd never once paid attention to before. The chicken coop leaning slightly east. The 3 missing pickets in the fence nobody had gotten around to mending. Her mother's rose bush, still blooming despite years of neglect, stubborn in a way Rowena suddenly, fiercely admired. Ready. Her father's voice was rough. She turned to look at her family gathered to see her off, the way you'd gather to see off a soldier or a coffin. Her mother twisting her apron in work-worn hands. Odessa dabbing at eyes that had cried real tears at least once this week. Her father solid and unreadable as a stone wall. No, Rowena said honestly. But I'll go anyway. Her mother pulled her into an embrace that smelled of lye soap and lavender and every small comfort of a home Rowena was about to leave behind for good. You're worth more than you know, she whispered, low enough that no one else caught it. Don't let anyone tell you different. Rowena nodded, didn't trust her own voice to answer. Odessa's hug was briefer. Careful, the way you hugged something you didn't want to wrinkle. I'll never forget what you're doing, she said. That's what I'm afraid of, Rowena thought, but kept it behind her teeth. Her father handed her up onto the wagon seat, his grip firm on her elbow. You're a good daughter, Rowena. Better than I've likely deserved. It was the closest thing to tenderness she'd heard from him in years. It nearly undid her. The wagon lurched forward. Her family grew smaller behind her, her mother waving, Odessa pretty even in grief, her father already turning back toward the fields, before the wagon had cleared the gate. And then a rise in the land swallowed the farmhouse whole, and the only home Rowena Ashcroft had ever known was simply gone. She sat alone, with her hands folded in her lap, and let herself shake, just once, just for a moment, before she made herself stop, because shaking wouldn't get her west, because nobody was coming to take this back, because whatever waited at the end of this road, she was going to meet it standing up, even if standing up was the only thing she had left, that was entirely her own. The stagecoach journey west took the better part of a week, and every mile of it felt to Rowena like traveling further from any version of herself she recognized. She shared the cramped compartment with a rotating cast of strangers. A whiskey drummer whose breath could have stripped varnish. A minister's wife who spent 3 solid hours delivering an unrequested lecture on the sin of vanity. Apparently unaware or entirely aware, Rowena eventually decided that the woman she was lecturing owned exactly 2 dresses and had never once been accused of vanity in her life. A young married couple, so wrapped up in each other they didn't notice, when Rowena had to wedge herself against the door to give them room. At night the coach stopped at way stations that offered beds with questionable linens and meals that sat heavy and strange in the stomach. Rowena barely slept. She lay awake in rooms full of other people's breathing, turning the letter over in her mind, trying to build a man out of 30 careful, spare sentences and coming up, every time, with someone she couldn't quite picture. 33 years old. 9 years older than her. A man who'd asked for a wife the way you'd order lumber. Precise specifications. No sentiment wasted. What would he do, she wondered, somewhere around the 4th sleepless night, when he saw her face and understood the woman climbing down from that coach was not the golden girl in the tintype he'd been sent. Would he send her straight back? Could he even, was there a law that covered a substituted bride? And if there was, would it side with the man who'd been cheated? She didn't know. She only knew that in 2 more days she'd find out. The landscape had been changing for a while by the 4th day. Flat farmland had given way to rolling hills, and the rolling hills to something wilder, sage and scrub, and distances that made her eyes ache trying to take them in. The air itself smelled different out here, sharper, cleaner, carrying, faintly, the memory of mountains she couldn't yet see. Cheyenne Depot, 2 hours. The driver called down, and Rowena's stomach dropped straight through the floor of the coach. 2 hours. She pulled a small mirror from her bag and studied her own face, with the particular brutal honesty a person reserves only for themselves. Brown hair, coming loose from its pins. After days of travel, no amount of pinning could survive. Eyes the color of creek mud, that was Odessa's phrase for them, offered once, years ago, with no particular cruelty intended, and none needed for it to land like cruelty anyway. A face that was pleasant enough if nobody was looking too hard for beauty. A chin that suggested stubbornness. A mouth that had, somewhere around age 12, forgotten the shape of easy smiling. This was what $80 had bought a man in Wyoming Territory. Not the promise. The plain truth of her. She tucked the mirror away and did her best with the dress, though days of travel had creased it well past any help. Her mother had packed a small bottle of rose water, meant for a wedding morning, that was never coming the way anyone had planned it. Rowena dabbed a little at her wrists anyway, at her throat, behind her ears. The scent was delicate, hopeful, everything she thought that she currently wasn't. The coach crested a rise, and there it was, Cheyenne, sprawled in the valley below, bigger than she'd let herself imagine. An actual town with actual streets, not the frontier outpost of her fearful invention. Buildings clustered along a main thoroughfare, thrown up fast and raw the way a town grows when a railroad decides to run through it. In the distance, dark rail lines cut across the land like something had scarred it on purpose, the new track that had put this town on the map only the year before, still smelling of fresh-cut timber and coal smoke. Her hands started shaking again as they descended, and this time she let them. Because there wasn't any hiding it now. Because in 2 hours she'd become an accusation standing on a platform. Because whatever this man decided the moment he saw her face, she wouldn't have any say in it at all. Cheyenne Depot. End of the line. The coach rocked to a stop. Rowena sat frozen a moment too long, before the driver's voice pulled her back. Here we are, miss. Need help with your trunk? Yes. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Thank you. Her legs felt unreliable as she climbed down. The platform was solid under her boots, but the whole world seemed to tilt regardless, the way it does right before something you can't undo. And then she saw him, taller than her father, with shoulders that spoke plainly of hard, ongoing work. Dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Standing alone at the edge of the platform, with the particular stillness of a man entirely used to waiting, without fidgeting, without needing anyone's attention to make the waiting bearable. Even from a distance, there was something locked about him. A door, shut tight, that nobody had knocked on in a long while. He was walking toward her now, weaving between other travelers with an ease that suggested he knew exactly how to move through a crowd without letting it touch him. Closer and closer details resolved. A face that might have been called handsome if it weren't set so hard. Weathered, serious, eyes the gray of a sky before snow, cool, assessing, giving away exactly nothing. A scar cutting through his left eyebrow that lent the whole face a permanent edge of severity. He stopped 3 feet away. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them said anything at all. Miss Ashcroft. His voice matched the rest of him. Deep, spare. No welcome in it. No warmth. Just a statement waiting to be confirmed or denied. Rowena's throat had gone bone dry. Mr. Kane. His eyes narrowed. His jaw worked once. A small tightening at the hinge. Not quite suspicion. Close to it, though. Close enough. You're not what I expected. There it was. The moment she'd been dreading, since the letter first arrived, delivered with all the gentleness of a slap. Her hands were trembling badly enough now that she clasped them together in front of her, hoping the movement might hide it. The platform noise, people calling their farewells, horses stamping, the hiss of some engine somewhere down the line, all of it seemed to fade into a low roar in her ears. She could lie. She could smile and deflect the way she'd watched Odessa deflect 100 small disasters over the years, could invent some story about illness or delay and buy herself an hour, a day, however long it took to decide what came next. Or she could be, for the first time in her whole careful, useful, invisible life, entirely honest with a stranger who had every right to hate her for it. No, she said, meeting those gray eyes directly, because whatever else was about to happen, she refused to meet it with her chin down. I'm not. The truth sat between them on that platform like a third person nobody had invited. Thaddeus Kane's expression didn't change, but his hand, at his side, had curled slowly into a loose fist and let go again, the only sign he gave that something had landed. Surprise, maybe, or the leading edge of anger, not yet arrived. You care to explain that? Yes. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her nearly, as much as it seemed to surprise him. But not here, not on a platform with half this town listening. It was a gamble. She had no idea whether a man who wrote letters as spare and businesslike as his would care one way or another about privacy, about being spared a public scene. But she'd read those 30 sentences enough times to have the shape of him memorized, even if the shape had turned out to be wrong in every particular that mattered. A man that careful with his words was a man who valued order, control. He would not, she gambled, want a scene any more than she did. For a long moment he only looked at her. Reading her, she thought, the way you'd read a letter you weren't sure you wanted to finish. Then, without another word, he bent and lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing at all, and turned toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. Come on, then. She followed on legs that didn't entirely feel like her own, aware of curious eyes tracking their progress across the boards. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, with what dignity she could manage, arranging her skirts, while he secured the trunk behind them. When he climbed up beside her, the whole wagon dipped under his weight, and something in her chest dipped along with it. He took up the reins without looking at her, clicked his tongue, set the horses moving. They drove through Cheyenne in silence thick enough to touch. Rowena cataloged details, with the desperate focus of someone memorizing an escape route she had no intention of using, a mercantile with whitewashed walls, a saloon spilling piano music into the street, a church with a steeple reaching for a sky, so hard and blue it hurt to look at directly. The town shrank behind them. Still he said nothing. Finally, when Cheyenne had reduced itself to a smudge on the horizon at their backs, he spoke. Who are you? Rowena Ashcroft. She kept her voice level, though her hands, folded tight in her lap, betrayed her. Odessa's older sister. His jaw tightened. Where's Odessa? Home. Couldn't come? Wouldn't. Honesty tasted strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, like a food she'd heard of, but never tried. She realized, once the money had already been sent, that she'd made a mistake, that she couldn't leave home, that there was someone else back there she'd rather stay for. So your family decided to send you instead. Flat. Without inflection. Keep the money. Send a different daughter, and hope I wouldn't notice the substitution. Said out loud. In his voice it sounded even worse than it had felt living through it. Yes. And you agreed to this. Rowena turned to look at him properly then. Really look. That hard profile, fixed on the road ahead. A man who'd paid good money for companionship and received, instead, exactly the kind of fraud that could reasonably have him putting her right back on that stage without so much as a meal offered first. I agreed, she said quietly, because my father's farm was 3 months from ruin, and your money was the only thing standing between my family and losing it. I agreed because I'm 23, and unmarried, and I've never once in my life been anybody's first choice for anything. In my family, I'm the one you send when there's hard, unpleasant work that needs doing. She made herself keep going, though every instinct told her to stop. That doesn't make it right. You were deceived, and I was part of that deception, and I won't pretend otherwise to make either of us feel better about it. His hands tightened on the reins. He didn't look at her. You could have written, he said finally. Told me the truth before I sent the money west. You're right, I should have. She looked down at her own hands. But I didn't know any of this myself until 3 days before I left. By then the money was spent, and my father had already decided. And what's your decision? The question caught her off guard entirely. What? He did look at her now, and the force of that gray stare nearly stole the breath clean out of her. You climbed onto a stagecoach knowing exactly what kind of lie you were carrying into this territory. That takes one of two things: considerable courage or considerable desperation. He turned back to the road. So I'm asking plainly, what do you want? The question hung in the air between them, and Rowena realized, with something like a jolt, that no one, not her father, not her mother, certainly not Odessa, had ever once asked her that. Not what was expected of her. Not what would be useful. What she wanted. I want, she said slowly, testing each word as it left her. Not to be sent back in disgrace. A breath. I want this journey to have meant something, even if it wasn't what either of us bargained for. Another breath, and this one cost her more. And I want the chance to prove that even though I'm not what you paid for, I might still be what you need. That's a tall order, Thaddeus said. From a woman I met 10 minutes ago. I know. He was quiet a long while after that. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, and the steady clip of hooves against packed earth, and Rowena watched the country roll past, hills dotted with sage and juniper, mountains rising jagged and blue-shadowed against the horizon, and waited for whatever verdict he decided to hand down. There's something you should know, he said at last, and his voice had gone quieter, careful, guarded in a different way than before. 3 days before your coach was due, I received a letter, and signed. Rowena's stomach turned over slow and cold. It said the bride I was expecting might not be who I thought she was. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw working. Didn't say more than that. No name, no explanation, just a warning and no way to know who'd sent it or why. Someone knew. Rowena's voice had gone thin. Someone back home or someone here. Someone knew before I ever stepped off that coach. Seems that way. Who? I don't know. His eyes cut to her, and for the first time she saw something in them besides suspicion. A kind of tired, wary curiosity, a man trying to solve a puzzle that had arrived on his doorstep already half assembled by hands he couldn't see. But somebody out here wanted me forewarned, or wanted you exposed, before you'd even had the chance to open your mouth. He paused. Which makes me wonder which one of those it was meant to be. Rowena sat with that for a long moment, the wagon rattling beneath them, the enormity of it settling slow into her chest. She had come a long way carrying a secret she'd meant to control the telling of, meant to choose, herself, how and when the truth got said and to whom. Someone had already taken that choice half away from her before she'd even arrived. I don't know anyone in this territory, she said finally. I've never set foot this far west in my life. I don't know who would have written such a thing, or how they'd have known enough to write it. No, Thaddeus agreed. But somebody did, and I'd like very much to find out who, before it becomes a problem bigger than a letter. They drove the rest of the way to the ranch in a different quality of silence than before, less hostile now, more watchful, two people each turning over a puzzle that had grown a second, uglier piece in the space of one conversation. Rowena studied the country they passed through, trying, despite everything, to imagine building a life inside it. It was beautiful in a stark, unsparing way. Nothing at all like the soft green farmland she'd left behind. This was land that demanded to be respected. Land that would break the careless, without apology, and offer no second tries to the weak. The sun was sinking behind the mountains when Thaddeus turned the wagon off the main road and onto a track that wound down through a narrow valley. Cottonwoods lined a creek running silver in the last light, and beyond them, buildings began to take shape against the darkening sky. The ranch house was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, a porch wrapping the front, weathered but plainly well-tended. A barn stood nearby, its paint faded to the color of dried blood. Corrals, outbuildings, the whole scattered architecture of a working ranch that had been built, board by board, out of one man's stubbornness. 160 acres, Thaddeus said, following her gaze. Cattle, mostly. The creek runs year-round. Makes the land worth more than twice its size without water. He pulled the wagon to a stop and made no move to climb down. It's not fancy, he said, but it's sound. It's beautiful, Rowena said, and meant it entirely. He glanced at her sharply, as if suspecting mockery. Whatever he found in her face seemed to settle something in him, because he climbed down without another word and came around to help her, from the wagon, his hands firm at her waist, as he lifted her to the ground. The contact sent something unexpected. Through her, an awareness of his strength, his solidity, the warmth of him even through layers of fabric. He released her quickly, stepping back like the touch had cost him something, and turned to see to the horses. Go on in, he said without looking at her. I'll bring your trunk after I've settled the team. Rowena climbed the porch steps on legs that still didn't feel entirely her own. The door wasn't locked. Nothing out here she supposed needed to be miles from any neighbor. Inside, the dim room revealed itself slowly. A stone fireplace, 2 chairs that had seen better years, a table with mismatched chairs, a cook stove, and shelves of dishes. Everything ordered, almost aggressively neat, the way a man might arrange his surroundings, when he'd learned the hard way that chaos left unattended tends to spread. She lit a lamp when he told her to, standing there uncertain in the doorway until his voice came from behind. When the light bloomed and the room came properly into focus, she understood something about him she hadn't before. This wasn't the house of a man who'd simply needed help with chores. This was the house of a man keeping very careful watch over every corner of a life he'd built alone, brick by brick, because he'd learned that nobody else was coming to help him build it. They ate together that first night, beans and bacon, nothing fine but hot and plain, and enough, and spoke little. When the meal was cleared, Thaddeus stood at the window along, while with his back to her, and Rowena understood, watching him, that whatever verdict he'd been weighing all evening was about to be delivered. I've been thinking, he said finally. Rowena's heart climbed straight into her throat. Yes, about what you said. On the road. He turned to face her, and the lamplight caught the scar, through his brow, made it look, for a moment, almost gentle. About proving you're what I need, even if you're not what I paid for. And I'm not sure what I need if I'm honest with you, he said. Company, I suppose. Somebody to talk to besides cattle and weather. Somebody to make this place feel less like a way station and more like something a man could call a home. I can do that, Rowena said quietly. If you'll let me try. Can you? His gaze was direct, searching. You've been here 3 hours. You don't know this life. Don't know if you can bear the isolation, the work, winters out here that'll freeze the breath right out of your chest. You might last a week, before you're begging me to put you back on that coach. I might, she admitted. Or I might surprise you. The corner of his mouth moved, there and gone, not quite a smile. You've already managed that once today. He was quiet a long moment, and Rowena held her breath, waiting. Here's what I'm proposing, he said at last. You stay. We give it 3 months trial. You manage the house. I pay you a fair wage for honest work, same as I'd pay any hired hand. At the end of it, we'll both know better what we're dealing with each other, and with whoever wrote that letter. If you want to go, I'll pay your passage home myself, no questions asked. If you want to stay. He stopped there, didn't finish it. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even really an acceptance. But it was a door left open, more than she'd had any right to expect, from a man she'd deceived, before she'd even learned the color of his eyes. 3 months, Rowena repeated. And you'll pay me, same as any hired help. Fair's fair. He extended his hand. She looked at it a long moment, scarred, work roughened, steady as the land itself, and thought about the farm behind her, her father's grim relief, her mother's worn face, Odessa's golden future already forgiven, and moving forward without a backward glance. She thought about the lie that had carried her here and the truth that might, if she was very careful and very lucky, let her stay on something closer to honest terms. She took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, real in a way that steadied something in her chest that had been shaking since the moment the coach pulled into that platform. "We have a deal," she said. Outside, the last light was fading fast, over the valley, and somewhere out in that darkening country, whoever had written a warning letter about a bride, who wasn't what she claimed to be, was still out there, watching, perhaps, waiting to see what she'd do next. Rowena didn't know it yet, standing in that lamplit kitchen, with her hands still warm from his. But the 3 months she'd just agreed to would turn out to be the least of what this land was about to ask of her. 3 weeks in, and Rowena Ashcroft had learned the shape of this house the way she'd once learned the shape of that scrubbed thin pot back home. By touch, by habit, by the particular creak of the third stair that announced her coming before she ever rounded the corner. 3 weeks, that was all it had been, except it felt longer, which frightened her a little if she let herself sit with it too long, so mostly she didn't. She'd found the fabric trunk in the second week. Bolts of it, folded careful in a corner of the empty bedroom upstairs. Deep green like pine shadow, soft blue like the sky right before full dark, cream muslin fine enough for anything a woman might want. Thaddeus had bought it, he told her, gruff and looking anywhere but at her face a while back, thinking a house should have such things. He hadn't said thinking a wife might need them. He hadn't needed to. Rowena had cut curtains from the blue that same afternoon, and by the time Thaddeus came in from the south pasture that evening, she had them pinned and half-stitched across the kitchen table, and he'd stood in the doorway a long moment just looking at the mess of it. At her, bent over the fabric, with a mouth full of pins the way her own mother used to do. "You work fast," he'd said. "I told you." She hadn't looked up. "I'm used to being useful," because that was the safest word between them still. Useful. Not anything more dangerous than that. Not yet. The mornings had fallen into a rhythm neither of them had planned out loud. Rowena up before the light, coffee going, biscuits in the oven before Thaddeus ever came in, from the barn smelling of hay and cold air and something underneath that she'd started, against her own better judgment, to notice. He'd sit across the table and eat like a man who'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, that food could be anything besides fuel. Until the biscuits, anyway, until she watched him pause on the third one, turn it over once in his hand like he was checking it for a trick. "These are good," he said, like an accusation. "Thank you. Better than anything I've had since—" He stopped himself, set the biscuit down. "Since?" "Nothing." He picked the biscuit back up. Ate it anyway, which told her more than any sentence he might have finished. She didn't push. Not that morning. Because pushing, she was learning, only made him retreat behind a different kind of quiet, not the comfortable stillness of two people working side by side, but a locked kind, a door she hadn't yet earned the right to knock on. So she waited, and the waiting, it turned out, was its own kind of education. She learned he read at night, poetry of all things, from a shelf she hadn't expected a rancher to keep, Whitman, dog-eared, and a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. So worn the spine had gone soft as cloth. She learned he talked to his cattle the way other men talked to old friends, low and steady, and that he had a particular fondness for a massive red bull named General Grant, that he claimed had more sense than half the officers he'd served under. She learned, too, that certain rooms in the house stayed closed. Not locked, just closed. And she'd understood, without being told, that some doors in this place weren't meant to be opened by her yet, and so she left them be, and told herself that was patience, and not simply fear of what she might find. It was Prudence Lang who first mentioned the name Voss. Prudence and her husband Wendell ran the spread 2 ridges over, and they'd ridden out one bright, cold Sunday with a basket of preserves, and the particular open curiosity of people who lived far enough from town that any new face was an event worth investigating properly. "So you're the one," Prudence said, settling herself at the kitchen table like she'd been sitting at it her whole life. Who finally talked Thaddeus Kane into curtains? I can't take full credit. He bought the fabric. Did he? Prudence's eyebrows went up, and she traded a quick look with her husband that Rowena couldn't quite read. Well, that's new. Wendell, a broad, quiet man who seemed content to let his wife do most of the talking for both of them, cleared his throat. Man's been rattling around this house alone a good long while, Mrs. He stopped. Forgive me, Miss Ashcroft. Been a long while since there was a reason to say the name different. Rowena felt her face go warm. It's not, we're not. Course not. Prudence waved a hand, unbothered, already moving on. None of my business either way. But I'll say this much. It's good to see smoke coming steady from that chimney again. Been a good while since this place looked lived in properly. Since? Rowena hesitated, because she wanted to ask. Because asking felt like trespassing on ground she hadn't been invited onto. But the question came out anyway, careful before she could stop it. Since his wife. The table went quiet. Prudence and Wendell traded another look, longer this time, and Rowena understood immediately she'd stepped somewhere she shouldn't have. He hasn't told you. Prudence said it soft. Not a question really. No. Then it's not my place. Prudence reached over and patted Rowena's hand, kind and firm at once. You'll hear it from him when he's ready, or you won't hear it at all, and either way that's between the two of you. But I'll say this, dear, and then I'll leave it be. She leaned in slightly. Whatever you hear about it from anyone, you be careful who you believe. There's more than one story about how Constance Kane died, and not all of them are true, and one man in this territory has spent 3 years making sure the wrong one's the one that stuck. Who? Wendell answered this time, low and flat. Thorne Voss. The name sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. He owns the land north of here, Wendell went on, and the land east of that, and he'd like very much to own the land Thaddeus is standing on account of the creek that runs through it, which happens to be the only water source for 6 miles, that doesn't run dry come August. He shook his head slow. Man's been trying to buy Thaddeus out since before Constance passed. Hasn't stopped trying since. And you're saying he had something to do with? I'm saying be careful, Wendell said again, gentler now. That's all I'll say on it. Rest is Thaddeus's to tell, when and if he's ready. They left an hour later, the basket of preserves traded for one of Rowena's own, dried apples, because it was all she'd had ready, and Rowena stood in the yard along, while after their wagon disappeared, over the ridge, turning the name over in her mind. Thorne Voss, because that was the thing about a name like that, once you had it. It sat in you. Waited. The anonymous letter came back to her then, unbidden, the way things do when you've been trying hard not to think about them. Someone had known she wasn't who Thaddeus expected, before she'd even arrived. Someone had wanted him warned, or wanted her exposed. And Rowena had spent 3 weeks quietly hoping the question might simply fade, if she didn't poke at it too hard. It hadn't faded. It had only been waiting its turn. She found the letters 2 nights later, entirely by accident, looking for extra blankets in the chest at the end of the hall. The one Thaddeus had told her that first night held spares for when the weather turned brutal. The blankets were there. So was a small wooden box, tucked beneath them, plain and unadorned, the kind of box a man buries things in when he doesn't quite trust himself to burn them. She shouldn't have opened it. She told herself that even as her hands were already lifting the lid. Letters. Dozens of them, the paper gone soft and yellow at the folds, all in the same careful, deliberate hand she recognized, from her own letter of proposal months back. Some addressed to nobody at all. Some simply headed to whoever might read this. None of them, as far as she could tell, from the unbroken seals still on half of them, had ever been sent. She read one. Just one, she told herself. Just to understand. I keep waking expecting to hear her in the kitchen. 3 years now, and my body hasn't learned the house is quiet. I built this place for 2 people, and I don't know how to make it feel like less than a mausoleum for one. Her hands were shaking by the time she set it down. Because 3 years. Because her. Because Constance Kane had been dead 3 years, and this man had been living inside, that grief the whole time, silent, the way he did everything, and Rowena had been sleeping down the hall from all of it without knowing a single word. She put the letters back exactly as she'd found them. Closed the box, closed the chest, went to bed, and lay staring at the ceiling for a long while, feeling like a thief, feeling like she'd stolen something even, though nothing physical had left that room. She didn't tell him what she'd found. Not yet, because there wasn't a way to say it that didn't also say I went looking where I wasn't invited, and she wasn't ready to see his face when he heard that. So she waited, again, because waiting, it turned out, was becoming the whole shape of her life out here, waiting for trust, waiting for truth, waiting for whatever was coming next to finally show its face. It showed its face on a Tuesday, near the end of the second month, in the form of Thorne Voss himself, riding up the drive on a horse too fine for a man, who claimed, loudly and often, to be a simple rancher like everybody else. Rowena was hanging wash when she heard the hoofbeats. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and found herself looking at a man perhaps 10 years older than Thaddeus, silver starting at his temples, dressed sharp enough for church on a weekday. He swung down from his horse with an ease that suggested he'd practiced the motion in front of a mirror, and his smile, when it landed on her, showed considerably more teeth than warmth. Well, he removed his hat with a small theatrical flourish. This must be the young woman half the county's been talking about. Mr. Voss, I presume. You've heard of me. His smile widened. All good things, I hope. I couldn't say. She kept her voice even. I've only just arrived myself. I don't know enough yet to have an opinion. Diplomatic. His gaze sharpened, cataloging her, the way a man might size up livestock at auction. Kane's a lucky man. I'd heard he sent for a bride and got. He stopped himself, though not quite quickly enough to hide that he'd meant to finish the sentence. Well, never mind what I heard. Rowena's spine went very straight. Finish it. I beg your pardon? You started to say something about what you'd heard. Finish it, Mr. Voss. I'd rather know than wonder. Something moved behind his practiced charm, surprise, maybe, that she hadn't simply let it pass the way she suspected most people out here let his half-finished insults pass. Then the smile came back, smoother than before. Only that I'd heard he sent for one sister and got another, Voss said. Word travels out here. Small territory. Big mouths. He tilted his head slightly. Must have been a disappointment. For him, I mean, sending for one thing and receiving quite another. He seems satisfied with the arrangement. Does he? Voss's eyes traveled once, slow, over the curtains hanging fresh in the kitchen window, the wash on the line, the whole domestic scene she'd built these past weeks out of nothing. I'm sure he does. For now. Was there something you needed, Mr. Voss? Just being neighborly. He set his hat back on, unhurried. I like to know who's living on land that borders mine, especially land with water on it. A man in my position, you understand, I have to think about these things. Continuity, stability. His gaze cut back to her, and something colder moved beneath the charm now, plain enough that Rowena felt it land in her stomach like a stone. Wouldn't want anything unstable happening to disrupt an arrangement like this one. Would be a shame. After all the trouble everyone's gone to. He was gone before she could ask what exactly he meant by that. Riding off unhurried, whistling something tuneless, leaving Rowena standing in the yard, with the wet wash forgotten in her hands, and a cold feeling settling into her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She told Thaddeus, that evening over supper, every word of it, as close as she could remember. His jaw had gone tight before she'd finished. He came here. He said he was being neighborly. He's never once in 3 years been neighborly. Thaddeus set down his fork, appetite apparently gone. What else did he say? That it would be a shame if something unstable happened to disrupt the arrangement. Rowena watched his face carefully. Thaddeus, what does he want? Why does he care so much what's happening on your land? For a long moment she didn't think he'd answer. He sat there, jaw working, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, and she thought she was about to watch that door close again, the way it always did. Except it didn't. "The creek," he said finally, low. "It's the only water on this side of the valley that runs year-round. Everyone else out here depends on wells that go dry by August most years, or on hauling water from mine, which I've always let them do, because that's what neighbors are supposed to do for each other." His hands had curled into fists on the table without his seeming to notice. "Voss has been trying to buy this land off me since before—" He stopped. "Since before Constance died," Rowena said quietly. His head came up sharp. "How do you know that name?" There it was, the moment she'd been dreading, since the wooden box, and now it had simply arrived, uninvited, the way most hard truths seem to. "Prudence Lang mentioned her," Rowena said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "She said I should be careful who I believed about how she died, that there was more than one story going around." Thaddeus's face went very still, very controlled. The look Rowena was beginning to understand, of a man holding a door shut with his whole body. "There's only one true story," he said finally. "The rest is just Voss's version, spread wide enough and long enough that half this territory believes it now instead." "Tell me the true one." "Why?" It wasn't hostile the way he said it, just tired, genuinely asking. "Because I live in this house," Rowena said. "Because you're carrying something heavy enough that it's shaped every room in it, whether you say her name or not, and I'd rather carry it honestly beside you than keep stumbling into corners of it by accident." He looked at her a long while. "3 years ago," he said finally, "Voss wanted this creek, made an offer for the land, low, insulting, and I turned it down flat. He didn't take it well, started making trouble, cutting fence, running his cattle onto my grass at night, small things, deniable things, the kind of thing you can't prove and can't quite ignore either." His voice had gone rough. "Constance rode out one evening to check the fence line herself. Alone. I told her to wait for me. She didn't." He stopped there a moment and Rowena didn't push. "Her horse came back without her," he said finally. "Fence had been cut clean through, right where she'd have been riding. She was thrown. Hit her head on the rocks along the creek bed. Died before I found her." "Thaddeus." Everyone called it an accident. His eyes had gone somewhere far away. "Maybe it was. I've never been able to prove it wasn't. But I know that fence was whole 2 days before, and I know Voss's men had been seen riding that stretch of my land that same week, and I know he offered to buy me out again not 2 months after she was in the ground, like he thought grief might make me careless enough to finally sell." His jaw was granite. "I told him no. I've told him no every year since. And every year since, something goes wrong on this ranch that I can never quite trace back far enough to prove." Rowena reached across the table and put her hand over his fist, gentle, and felt it slowly uncurl beneath her palm. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. I don't want your pity. It's not pity." She held his gaze steady. "It's grief, Thaddeus. Grief for a woman I never met, who loved a man stubborn enough to keep fighting for land other people would have sold 3 years ago just to make the fighting stop. That's not pity. That's respect." His face changed then, the wall behind his eyes lowering, just a little, just enough to see through. "She'd have liked you," he said, quiet. "I think. She didn't like many people. Had a sharp tongue, and no patience for foolishness. A ghost of something almost like a smile. You'd have driven each other half mad, probably. And gotten along famously doing it." Rowena didn't trust herself to answer that. She only tightened her hand over his and they sat like that a long while, the fire burning low, the letter she still hadn't confessed to reading sitting heavy and unspoken between them, and something new, fragile, unnamed, entirely uninvited, settling quietly into the space where his grief had been standing guard alone for 3 long years. The fire came 11 days later. Rowena woke to the smell of smoke before she woke to the sound of it, some animal part of her brain understanding the danger before her conscious mind had caught up, and by the time she was fully upright in bed she could already hear Thaddeus shouting somewhere below, and orange light was flickering wrong and violent through her window where only darkness should have been. She was down the stairs, and out the door in seconds, bare feet finding stones, and cold ground she didn't feel at all. The barn. Flames were climbing the south wall already, hungry, fast, the kind of fast that told her, even half panicked, even barely thinking, that this hadn't started slow. Hadn't started the way accidents start. The horses were screaming inside, and Thaddeus was already at the well, hauling water in buckets that seemed absurdly small against what was eating through his barn wall by the second. "The horses!" he shouted, seeing her. "Get them out! North pasture! Close the gate behind!" She didn't hesitate. She ran straight into smoke thick enough to sting her eyes blind, found the first stall by feel more than sight, and hauled the frightened animal out by main force of will, half dragging, half being dragged, until they broke into clean air, and she could slap its flank hard enough to send it bolting for open ground. Back in, because there wasn't time to think about whether that was wise, because the second horse was screaming louder than the first had, and the smoke was thicker now, and the heat was pressing down like something with actual weight. She got the second horse out. Then the third, a young colt, that nearly trampled her twice in its panic, before she got a hand on its halter, and hauled it clear. "That's all of them," Thaddeus's voice, somewhere behind her, black with soot, hoarse from smoke. "Get back. Get to the house. I'm not leaving you here alone. Rowena, I'm not leaving." She grabbed a bucket instead of answering further, and joined him at the well, and they worked side by side in grim, wordless rhythm. Fill, carry, throw, return, for what felt like hours, and was probably closer to one, until Thaddeus finally caught her arm and pulled her back from the heat. "It's lost." His voice had gone rough with more than smoke. "The barn's gone. We save the house now or we lose everything." They spent what remained of the night building a fire break between the barn and the house, soaking the ground, wetting down the porch and walls, working until Rowena's arms had gone past aching, into a kind of numb she'd never felt before. By the time the sun came up, painting the sky the raw pink gold of a wound, the barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton, smoke still rising off it thin and mean, and the house, soot-streaked, exhausted but standing, had survived. Thaddeus stood staring at the wreckage for a long time. His hands, she noticed only now, were blistered and burned, and he didn't seem to have noticed at all. "Come inside," she said. "Let me see to your hands. I need to check the stock. After." Her voice left no room in it for argument. "You're no good to any of them if infection sets in, Thaddeus. Inside. Now." He let her lead him, which told her more than anything he could have said about how deep the exhaustion ran. She sat him at the table and cleaned his burns with a gentleness that surprised her own hands, wrapping them in clean cloth, while he sat and watched her work. "You should have stayed at the house," he said finally. "So should you. It's my barn, my stock, my responsibility." "I live here too," Rowena said, tying off the last bandage. "That makes it mine as well, whether you like it or not." He was quiet a moment. Then, "Thank you. For the horses. For all of it. You'd have done the same." "I did do the same," he said. "For you. Once you were inside that barn, whether I liked the risk or not." His face had gone raw, unguarded, the wall between them thinner than she'd ever seen it. "I don't know what I'd have done if that fire had taken you along with the building." Rowena didn't have an answer for that. She only reached out and covered his bandaged hand with her own, careful of the burns, and let the silence say what neither of them was quite ready to say aloud. He found the cause an hour later, once the sun was fully up, and he could see well enough to search the wreckage properly. "Lantern," he said, holding up the twisted, blackened remains of it. "Hung on a rope in the hayloft. I don't keep lit lanterns anywhere near that loft. Never have. Rope like that burns through in under an hour once it's lit and left." "You're saying someone did this on purpose?" "I'm saying someone came onto my land in the night and hung a lit lantern exactly where it would do the most damage on rope time to burn through while everyone in this house was asleep. His jaw had gone hard as the burned wood in his hand. That's not an accident, Rowena. That's a message. From Voss. I can't prove it. He said it, through his teeth, frustration plain in every word. Same as I could never prove it 3 years ago. But I know it, same as I know my own name. Rowena thought of the man on the fine horse, the smile with too many teeth, the way he'd said wouldn't want anything unstable happening like he was commenting on the weather. He warned us, she said slowly, right to my face, and I didn't understand it until now. He's done this before. Thaddeus's voice had gone flat and cold in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. Small things, never enough to prove, always enough to hurt. He wants this land, and he's decided the fastest way to get it is to make it too costly for me to keep. Then we fight him. Thaddeus looked at her, genuinely startled. Fight him how? I don't know yet. Rowena straightened her shoulders, feeling something steady itself in her chest even, as everything around them lay in ashes. But I didn't come this far, and burn down every bridge behind me just to watch some man, with a fine horse, and an ugly smile take what's yours out from under you. We'll find proof. We'll find a way. Something eased in Thaddeus's expression then. Not quite a smile the burns and exhaustion wouldn't allow for, that yet, but something close to it. Something that looked, for the first time, since she'd met him on that platform in Cheyenne, almost like hope. They started rebuilding the following week, timber hauled down from the North Ridge, neighbors arriving in 2s and 3s to help with the framing, Wendell and Prudence first, then Tom Hollis from the next spread over, then, unexpectedly, a shy young man named Jesse Poole who'd only just settled in the territory, and said simply that he figured neighbors ought to help neighbors, whatever some folks in town were saying about the arrangement out at the Kane place. Rowena worked alongside them, passing tools, holding timber steady, and felt something building in her chest to match the barn rising slow around them, board by board. Belonging. That was the word for it, though she was careful not to say it out loud yet, even to herself. It was into this cautious, hard-won rhythm that her father arrived. She heard the wagon before she saw it, recognized something in the particular uneven rattle of it, before her mind had even caught up to why, and by the time it crested the rise and rolled into the yard, her stomach had already dropped clean through the ground. Elam Ashcroft climbed down looking older than she remembered. Thinner. His coat hung wrong on him, the way clothes hang on a man who's lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. Papa. The word came out of her strange, foreign, like a language she'd half forgotten how to speak. Rowena. He looked past her, at the half-built frame of the new barn, at the house with its fresh curtains, at all the evidence of a life she'd built here without him. Well, look at all this. What are you doing here? Can't a father visit his daughter? You never once visited before I left home. Why start now this far out? Something in his face tightened. He glanced toward the house, toward the door, where Thaddeus had just appeared, drawn by the sound of the wagon, and Rowena watched her father's expression do a fast, calculating shift she recognized, from a lifetime of watching him size up a bad harvest and figure out who'd have to go without. We need to talk, he said. Alone. They walked to the edge of the yard, out of easy earshot, and Rowena felt every step of it like walking toward something she already knew the shape of and dreaded anyway. The farm's in trouble, her father said without preamble. Worse than before. The bank's calling the note early. I need more than we've got. I don't have money, Papa. Whatever Mr. Kane pays me goes toward. He's got money. Her father's eyes cut toward the house, toward Thaddeus standing watchful on the porch. Land like this, cattle, he can spare it. You want me to ask him for money. I want you to remember what your family did for you. Her father's voice had gone hard, the voice she remembered, from that kitchen months ago, the voice that had decided her whole life, without asking her opinion of the decision. We sent you out here, gave you this chance at a life you never would have had otherwise. You sold me, Rowena said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. You spent Odessa's passage money and sent me to cover the debt and dressed it up as opportunity because that was easier for you to live with. I know the difference now, Papa. I didn't back home. I do now. Her father's face flushed dark. You'll ask him. No. Rowena. No. She said it again, and this time something in her chest, that had been bent double her whole life, straightened, slow and permanent. If you tell him the truth of how this began, that I came here under a lie you built, not one I chose, you'll only be confirming what I've already told him myself weeks ago, standing on a train platform, because I decided honesty mattered more than whatever comfort a lie might have bought me. So go ahead. Tell him whatever you like. I have nothing left to fear from the truth, Papa. I only wish I'd learned that before I ever climbed onto that coach. Her father stared at her like he was looking at a stranger. Maybe Rowena thought he was. You'd choose him, her father said finally, low, bitter. Over your own family. I'd choose honesty, she said. Over whatever it is we've been calling family all these years. She held his gaze, though it cost her more than she let show. I'm sorry the farm is struggling. I mean that, but I won't ask a man who's given me nothing, but fair dealing to hand, over money to cover debts he had no part in creating. Not even for you. Elam Ashcroft looked at her a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and climbed back onto his wagon and drove out of the yard without so much as a backward glance, and Rowena stood watching him go, with a strange, hollow feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite name, not quite grief, not quite relief, something tangled between the two, that she suspected she'd be untangling for a long while yet. Thaddeus came to stand beside her once the wagon had disappeared over the rise. You didn't have to send him away on my account, he said quietly. I didn't. Rowena kept her eyes on the empty road. I sent him away on my own account. There's a difference even if it looks the same from where you were standing. He didn't say anything to that. He only reached over and took her hand, and they stood together along, while in the yard, the half-built barn behind them, the mountains going purple with evening ahead of them, and Rowena felt, for the first time, since that letter had first arrived at her father's kitchen table months ago, something that might, cautiously, carefully, be called peace. It didn't last, because 3 days later, Thaddeus rode out to check the herd in the north pasture, and came back an hour later with a face like carved stone. The creek, he said, before he'd even fully dismounted. Someone's dammed it, upstream on Vossland, but the diversion's cutting the flow onto mine down to a trickle. His hands were fists again. Cattle have been walking 2 extra miles a day just to reach water that used to run right through the home pasture. Give it a couple of weeks at this rate and I'll start losing stock. He's escalating. He's declaring war, Thaddeus said, grim. The fire was a warning. This is the start of the fight itself. Rowena felt something cold and clear settle into her chest, not fear, though there was fear in it too, but something harder underneath the fear. Something that had been building in her, since the day she'd stood on that platform and decided honesty was worth more than comfort. Then we don't run from it, she said. We find proof of what he's doing, and we take it to whoever in this territory still answers to the law instead of to Thornvoss's money. Thaddeus looked at her a long moment, worry and something that might have been pride moving behind his gray eyes, and underneath both, unmistakable now, something warmer still, that neither of them had, yet found the courage to name out loud. You're not what I expected, he said finally. The day you stepped off that coach. No, Rowena agreed, watching the mountains hold the last of the light. I don't suppose I am. Behind them, the new barn stood half-framed against the darkening sky, and somewhere upstream, water that should have been running free through Thaddeus Kane's pasture was pooling instead behind a dam built by a man who had already, once, taken everything from him and walked away untouched. Rowena intended to see that it didn't happen twice. They didn't wait for the water to drop any further before they acted. That was the decision Rowena made, standing at the creek bed the morning after Thaddeus told her about the dam, watching the current already thinning to something that looked more like a memory of a creek than the real thing. 2 weeks, Thaddeus said, hat pushed back, doing the same grim math she was doing. Maybe 3 if we're careful with the herd. After that we start losing stock in earnest. Then we don't have 3 weeks to waste feeling helpless about it, Rowena said. We have 3 weeks to find something Voss can't smile his way out of. They rode to Wendell and Prudence Lang's place that same afternoon, because Wendell had lived in this territory longer than almost anyone, and because if there was a way to fight a dam built on another man's land, Rowena suspected it wouldn't be found sitting in Thaddeus's kitchen waiting for inspiration to arrive on its own. Water rights. Wendell said it like the words tasted bad in his mouth. That's the word you want, though good luck finding a judge out here who'll hear the case, before your cattle are already dying of thirst. There has to be something, Rowena said. Some law, some precedent. There's the law. Prudence poured coffee, set it down harder than she needed to. And there's Thorn Voss's money, which has a way of getting to the judge in Cheyenne about a week before the law does. She looked at Rowena steady, over the table. You want to stop that man, dear, you're not going to do it with paperwork. Man like that's been careful his whole life. Never leaves a mess anybody can point to. He left a mess once, Wendell said slowly. Rowena's head came up. What do you mean? Wendell was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup like he was deciding how far back to reach into his own memory. Before he came out here, before any of us knew him, there was talk years back, mind, before Constance ever married Thaddeus even, that Voss ran some kind of scheme back east. Land speculation. Sold parcels to folks that turned out not to be his to sell. Never proved. Never charged, far as I know. But the talk followed him out here anyway, the way talk does. He shrugged. Man showed up in this territory with money nobody could quite account for, and a story about it that never sat right with anybody who bothered to ask twice. Where, Rowena said very carefully, would a person find proof of something like that? Courthouse records, maybe, wherever he came from. Wendell shook his head. Which could be anywhere and could take a good long while to search, longer than you've got water left in that creek. Except Rowena had a memory scratching at the back of her mind now, small and stubborn, refusing to let go. Something Voss himself had said that first day in the yard, careless the way men get careless, when they think the woman across from them is only decoration. A man in my position, you understand. I have to think about these things. Continuity, stability, and something else. Something from a letter she'd read once, months ago, back when the only thing she'd known about Thorn Voss was a name. Ohio, she said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. He mentioned it once, in passing, to Thaddeus, something about property he'd once held in Ohio, before he came west. Her heart had started beating faster, because that was where her mother's sister lived, because that was where her own family's letters had gone, back and forth, for years, without her ever once thinking the place mattered for anything besides an address on an envelope. Because Odessa had gone quiet, hadn't she, in her last letter home? Something about Harlan Pruitt's family having connections there. Something Rowena had read once, fast and filed away, without understanding it might ever matter. I need to write to my sister, she said. Thaddeus looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Your sister. She's engaged to a banker's son. Bankers know things, Thaddeus. Bankers know exactly the kind of thing a man like Voss would have needed help hiding, once, a long time ago, in a state neither of us has ever set foot in. Rowena was already standing, already reaching for her coat. It's a thread. It's thin. But it's the only one we've got that doesn't require paperwork we can't reach in time. She wrote the letter that night by lamplight and tore up 3 drafts before she found words honest enough to send. Because there wasn't a version of this that didn't require asking Odessa for help. And there wasn't a version of asking Odessa for help that didn't also mean forgiving her at least a little for everything that had come before. Dessa, I need you to ask Harlan's father a question, and I need you not to ask me why until after you've asked it. Does the name Thorn Voss mean anything to the bank in connection with land dealings some years back? It matters more than I can explain in a letter. It might matter more than anything I've ever asked you for. She sent it the next morning by the fastest rider the depot could offer, one who'd carry it as far as the rail line, before handing it to the mail car, and then there was nothing to do but wait, while the creek kept dropping and Thorn Voss, she had no doubt, kept smiling that smile of his somewhere on the other side of the ridge, certain he'd already won. The days that followed were the longest of Rowena's life. She and Thaddeus hauled water by wagon, from the Lang's well twice daily, a stopgap that bought the herd time without solving anything, and she watched two of the younger calves go thin, and listless before her eyes, watched Thaddeus's jaw tighten a little more each morning he walked the creek bed, and found it lower than the morning before. 3 weeks passed that way, and then on a gray, wind-scoured afternoon near the end of the 3rd week, a wagon came up the drive, that wasn't her father's. Rowena knew the shape of it before she could see who was driving. Something in the particular flounce of the bonnet visible even at a distance. Something in the way the horse had been pushed too hard for too long by a driver, who didn't fully know how to manage a team. Odessa. She climbed down looking travel-worn in a way Rowena had genuinely never seen her look before. Hair coming loose, dress creased, dust on the hem she would once have dyed rather than be seen wearing. But her eyes, when they found Rowena's across the yard, had something in them Rowena didn't recognize either. Something steadier than the girl who'd cried pretty tears on a porch back home, and called it goodbye. "You didn't answer my letter," Rowena said. "I didn't trust a letter to carry it properly." Odessa's voice shook, just slightly. "So I came myself, rode the rail as far as it would take me, and hired this wagon the rest of the way once the track ran out. Odessa, that's 1,200 miles. I know how far it is, Rowena. I felt every one of them." Something rawer than the old performed distress crossed her sister's face. "You asked me for help. Once. In your whole life you asked me for something, and I nearly let a letter answer it instead of coming myself, and then I thought about that, and I thought about every single time you'd come running the moment I needed anything at all, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't send paper when you deserved a person." Rowena stood there a moment, unable to find words for the strange, aching thing moving through her chest. "What did you find?" she said finally. Odessa reached into her travel bag and pulled out a thin bundle of papers, held together with string, her hands not quite steady. "Harlan's father remembered the name the moment I said it." Odessa's voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of someone reciting something she'd made herself memorize exact. Thorn Voss sold parcels of land outside Columbus 11 years ago that he didn't hold clear title to. 6 families lost their savings before anyone caught the scheme unwound. He left before charges could be filed, vanished west with what money he'd collected, and the families who'd been cheated didn't have the means to chase him past the state line. She held the papers out. "This is a copy of the complaint filed against him, and a letter from the bank confirming they still hold the original, should it ever be needed by a court." Rowena took the papers, with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady of their own. Because there it was. Because after 3 weeks of dropping water and thin calves and a man smiling his terrible smile, from behind a legal wall nobody could seem to breach, here was a crack in that wall, small and thin, and entirely real, carried 1,200 miles by the sister who'd once let her carry everything alone. "Odessa." Rowena looked up and found she couldn't finish the sentence. "Don't." Odessa's eyes were bright. "Don't thank me yet. I've got a great deal more to apologize for than I've made up for, with one bundle of papers and a sore back from too many days on the rail and too many more in a wagon." A small, wet laugh escaped her. "But it's a start, isn't it?" "It's a start," Rowena agreed, and pulled her sister into an embrace that neither one of them, a year ago, would have believed either of them capable of meaning. Thaddeus was reading the papers by lamplight, that evening when he looked up at Rowena, something sharp and almost hopeful in his face. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough. A man defrauds 6 families in Ohio and runs before the law can catch him, and then shows up out here with money nobody could explain, cutting fence and burning barns and damming creeks that don't belong to him." His hand had tightened on the papers. "Marshall Holloway can't ignore this. Not with proof this solid sitting in front of him." He might try, Rowena said carefully. Voss has money. Money buys reluctance even in honest men. Then we make it impossible for him to look away. Thaddeus stood, already reaching for his coat. We ride to town tomorrow, all of us, and we lay this in front of the marshal in broad daylight, where half the county can see it happen, so there's no quiet way for anyone to make it disappear. They rode into town the next morning, Rowena, Thaddeus, Odessa, with Wendell and Prudence Lang riding alongside for good measure, because Wendell had said, simple and firm, that he'd lived beside Thorn Voss's cruelty long enough to want to be standing there the day somebody finally called it by its right name. Marshal Holloway's office sat at the end of the main street, and Rowena felt every eye in town swing toward their small procession as they passed. Because word traveled fast out here. Because a burned barn and a dammed creek and a woman who'd arrived under somebody else's name were exactly the kind of story a territory this size chewed on for months, and here it was, walking right down the middle of the street in broad daylight for anyone to see. Holloway was a heavy-set man with tired eyes and the particular weariness of someone who'd spent years hearing every complaint twice and believing about half of them. He looked up when they filed into his office, and something in his face went carefully blank the moment he registered who was standing in front of him. Mr. Kane. A nod. Cautious. Something I can do for you. You can look at this, Thaddeus said, and set the bundle of papers on the desk between them. Holloway read slowly. Rowena watched his face change. As he did, the careful blankness giving way, slow to surprise, and then to something that looked almost like relief, quickly hidden. Where'd this come from? He said finally. My sister wrote it here from Ohio, Rowena said. The bank in Columbus still holds the original complaint. 6 families defrauded 11 years back by a man who ran west before the law could catch up with him. You're saying Thorn Voss? I'm saying the name on this paper is the same name on the deed to the land bordering mine, Thaddeus said level. I'm saying that man has spent 3 years trying to take my creek by every means short of a fair offer, and burned my barn to the ground 4 months ago as a warning when I wouldn't sell, and damned the water running through my land not a month past. I'm saying you've had cause to look at him for a good while now, Marshal, and I'd like to understand why you haven't. Something flickered across Holloway's face, not quite guilt, but close enough to it, that Rowena's stomach turned over. Voss has done considerable business with this town, Holloway said carefully. Considerable business with a good many people in it. Man like that, accusations tend to come with complications. Complications, Thaddeus repeated, flat. I'm not saying I don't believe you. Holloway's jaw tightened. I'm saying proof and belief aren't always the same currency out here, and a man with Voss's money has a way of making trouble for anyone who moves against him without enough of the former. Then we'll get you more, Rowena said. Every head in the room turned toward her. You want proof beyond paper from Ohio? She went on steady, though her heart was hammering hard enough she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Then let's give the whole town cause to see what kind of man he is, in the open, where money can't quiet it after the fact. Call a gathering, church or the meeting hall, whatever this territory uses, when it needs everyone in one room at once. Let him stand there and answer for himself in front of the very people he's been robbing water and grazing land from for years. A man like that relies on privacy to do his worst work, Marshal. Take the privacy away from him and see what's left standing. Holloway studied her a long moment. You understand, he said slowly, that if you're wrong about how he'll respond, you're painting a target on your own back doing this. I understand. Rowena held his gaze. I've had a target on my back since the day I stepped off a stagecoach with a lie in my pocket and told the truth anyway, because the truth seemed like the only thing worth carrying that far. I'm not about to stop carrying it now. Something shifted in Holloway's tired face. Not quite a smile. Closer to respect. Sunday then, he said. After service. I'll see it announced. There was one more thing Rowena wanted before Sunday, and she went looking for it that same afternoon, while Thaddeus and Odessa saw to the horses. I need to ask you something, she said to Marshal Holloway, catching him alone at his desk. The anonymous letter Thaddeus received before I ever arrived. The one warning him I might not be who he expected. Has anything crossed your desk in all your dealings with Voss that might explain where a letter like that would have come from? Holloway was quiet a moment. Can't say for certain, but I'll tell you what I know. Voss has a habit of writing to folks he considers a threat before he ever moves against them directly. Sows a little doubt first, softens the ground. He shrugged. A man expecting a substituted bride, and already half suspicious of her, before she said a word, that's a man more likely to send her packing, without a fair hearing. Easier to drive a wedge into a marriage that never gets the chance to happen. Rowena felt something cold settle, and then, strangely, loosen in her chest at once. He was trying to make sure Thaddeus turned me away, before I ever had the chance to tell the truth myself. Wouldn't put it past him, Holloway said. Man plans 3 moves ahead of everybody else in the room. Only trouble is, this time the first move didn't take. She carried that back to Thaddeus that evening and watched something settle in him too. Not quite relief, but close to it. The last loose thread of a mystery finally tied off. He tried to end this before it started, Thaddeus said slowly. And it only made me watch you closer instead of less. Funny the way that worked out for him. Funny, Rowena agreed. Or fitting. The days between that afternoon and Sunday passed strange and slow, the way days do, when you know something enormous is coming, and there's nothing left to do but wait for it to arrive. Rowena spent them the only way she knew how, working. Because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking with nerves every waking hour, and the garden needed weeding, and there were curtains still unfinished in the second bedroom, and doing the ordinary things kept her, just barely, from unraveling completely. Odessa stayed. That surprised Rowena more than almost anything else, that strange, suspended week, that her sister, given every excuse to climb back into a wagon and return to the comfortable golden life waiting for her, simply didn't. I keep thinking, Odessa said one evening, the two of them shelling beans on the porch, while the light went long and gold across the valley. About all the years I let you carry things, not just the wedding. Before that, every single time something hard needed doing in that house, I let it land on you, and I told myself it was because you were better suited to it, and I never once stopped to ask whether you wanted to be suited to it at all. I wasn't given much choice about wanting it, Rowena said. Somewhere along the way, useful just became the only thing I was allowed to be good at. That's my fault. Some of it. Odessa's hands had stilled over the beans. I let people believe I was the one worth looking at because it was easier than telling them to look at both of us. I'm sorry, Ro. I don't know how many times I have to say it before it means something, but I'll keep saying it as many times as it takes. Rowena looked at her sister a long moment. The golden hair, dimmer now with days of travel dust in it. The face that had gotten away, with things Rowena's own face never could have, softened now by something that looked, for the first time in either of their lives, like genuine humility. It means something already, she said. You rode 1,200 miles to bring it. That's not nothing, Dessa. That's not nothing at all. Sunday came clear and cold, the whole valley washed in the particular hard blue light that only seemed to happen in this territory, nowhere Rowena had ever lived before. The meeting hall was full by the time they arrived. Fuller, Rowena suspected, than most Sundays saw it, word of what was coming having done exactly the work she'd hoped it would. Faces turned as they walked in. Whispers low and quick, the way whispers move, through a crowd that's been waiting all week for a story to finally arrive in the flesh. Thorne Voss was already there, seated near the front, with the easy, unbothered posture of a man who had never once in his life believed consequences were meant for him. He rose when he saw them come in, smiled that same smile, wide and cold. Miss Ashcroft. A small, mocking bow. Or is it Mrs. Kane now? I confess I've lost track of which lie we're currently observing. There's no lie left to observe, Mr. Voss. Rowena kept her voice level, though every part of her wanted to shake. I told Mr. Kane the truth the very first hour I met him. I've told nothing but the truth since. I'm not certain the same can be said for you. Something quick and unguarded crossed his eyes. Gone as fast as it came. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Rowena stepped forward and felt the whole room's attention shift. With her, a physical weight settling onto her shoulders that she made herself carry upright. I think you know exactly what I mean, because I think you've spent 11 years hoping nobody west of Ohio would ever find the papers I'm holding right now. And I think you sent an unsigned letter to Mr. Kane before I ever arrived, hoping he'd turn me away before I had the chance to tell him the truth myself. It didn't work, but it tells this room a good deal about the kind of man willing to try it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Marshall Holloway stood at the front of the room, the bundle of documents in his own hands now, his face carefully neutral in the way of a man determined to let the evidence speak before he did. Mr. Voss, Holloway said, I'd like you to explain a complaint filed against you in Columbus, Ohio, 11 years back. Land sold without clear title to 6 families, who lost their savings when the fraud came to light. You left the state before charges could be brought. The room had gone utterly silent. That's absurd. Voss's voice had lost some of its smoothness. Ancient history, unproven history, I might add, or I'd hardly be standing here a free man. Unproven doesn't mean untrue, Holloway said, and I'd wager a good many people in this room would like to hear you explain where your money truly came from, given what we now know about how it was made, before you ever set foot in this territory. This is a conspiracy. Voss's eyes had gone hard, darting now, calculating exits Rowena doubted existed for him anymore. Orchestrated by a woman who arrived here under a false name, no less, and a man who's held a grudge against me since his wife's unfortunate accident. Say her name, Thaddeus said. The whole room stilled further, if that was even possible. I beg your pardon? You said unfortunate accident like it's a phrase you rehearsed. Thaddeus's voice had gone low, and dangerous in a way Rowena had never once heard from him, not even the night of the fire. Say her name, Voss. Constance. Say it, if you're so certain what happened to her had nothing to do with the fence your men cut 2 days before she rode out to check it. I had nothing to do with. You never do. Thaddeus's voice cracked like a whip across the room. Nothing to do with the fence. Nothing to do with the lantern in my hayloft. Nothing to do with the dam choking my creek dry, while my cattle stand in mud that used to be water. You've spent 3 years having nothing to do with every piece of ruin that's landed on my doorstep, and every single time the ruin landed anyway. Voss's composure had finally, visibly, begun to crack. You can't prove any of that, he said, and his voice had gone thin now, stripped of its practiced charm. Not the fence, not the barn, none of it. No, Rowena said, stepping forward again, and this time her voice rang clear across the whole silent room. We can't prove all of it. Not yet, but we can prove this. She lifted the papers Odessa had carried 1,200 miles. We can prove you built the money that bought your way into this territory on the ruin of 6 families who trusted you. We can prove you ran, rather than face what you'd done. And I think, Mr. Voss, once this town understands what kind of man has been dealing with them honestly on paper and dishonestly in every dark corner besides, they'll start looking a great deal more carefully at every piece of trouble that's followed you west. The room had begun to murmur now, low and building, faces turning toward Voss, with a scrutiny Rowena suspected he hadn't felt directed at him in a very long while. This is slander, Voss said, but the words had lost their force entirely, coming out more plea than accusation. It's documentation, Marshall Holloway said, and something in his voice had firmed considerably since the papers first landed on his desk. Signed, witnessed, and confirmed by the bank that still holds the original complaint. I'll be writing to Ohio myself, Mr. Voss, to confirm every detail before this goes further. But I think you understand, better than anyone in this room, exactly what that confirmation is going to say. Voss looked around the hall at the faces that had, weeks ago, tipped their hats to him on the street, that had done business with him, drunk with him, trusted the smooth, easy charm he'd built his whole reputation on out here, and Rowena watched something in him finally understand that the charm had run out of road. He left without another word, pushed past the crowd at the door, mounted his horse in the street outside, and rode out of town at a pace that told everyone watching exactly how much ground he suddenly felt the need to put between himself and this valley. He didn't come back. Word reached them 2 weeks later, carried by Wendell Lang, with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering news he'd waited years to deliver. Voss had sold his holdings quiet, fast, well under their worth, to a company out of Denver, and left the territory entirely. Whether Ohio would ever formally charge him, whether the 6 defrauded families would ever see $1 of restitution, nobody in this valley could say for certain. But the dam came down within the week, torn apart by his own former hands, now working for somebody else entirely, somebody with no particular interest in choking a neighbor's creek dry out of old spite. Rowena stood at the creek bed the morning the water came back through, full and clean, and running the way it was always meant to run, and felt something in her chest come loose that had been held tight since the very first night her father set, that let her down on the kitchen table a lifetime ago. "It's running," she said, soft, mostly to herself. "It is." Thaddeus had come to stand beside her, the way he did most mornings now, that the shape of it barely registered as anything but ordinary anymore. "Cattle will be grateful. Is that all you've got to say about it? Cattle will be grateful?" He looked at her sideways, warmth moving plain behind the gray of his eyes now, no longer hidden the way it once had been. "What would you have me say instead?" Rowena turned to face him fully, the creek running silver, and full between the cottonwoods behind her, months of fear, and fire and damned water finally loosening their grip on her chest. "Something true," she said. "You're not bad at true, when you finally get around to saying it." A short laugh moved through him, real this time. "All right." He took her hand, careful, the burns from the fire long, since healed to thin pale lines across his palm. "True then. I sent for a woman I never met, out of loneliness I didn't know how to name any other way. And the woman who came instead wasn't the one I'd pictured, wasn't the one I thought I wanted, and turned out, somewhere in the months since, to be every single thing I actually needed, and never once knew how to ask for." Rowena felt her eyes go hot and full. "That's considerably more than I bargained for, Thaddeus Kane." "Good," he said. "I'd hate to think I was still under-delivering this far in." He paused, and something in his bearing changed, steadier, and at the same time more unguarded than she'd ever seen him. "Marry me, Rowena, properly. Not as a trial, not as an arrangement either of us can walk away from with our passage paid. I want your name next to mine because you chose it the same way I'm choosing you." "That's not a very romantic proposal," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady. "No," he agreed, "but it's true. I told you once I wasn't bad at true when I got around to saying it. I'm getting around to it now." "Then yes," Rowena said. "Yes, Thaddeus Kane, properly." They married 3 weeks later on a bright, wind-scrubbed morning in the half-finished new barn, because Prudence Lang declared the meeting hall too small for everyone who wanted to come and see it done. Wendell walked Rowena the short distance, from the house to the barn doors himself, since her own father hadn't been asked and hadn't been expected. Odessa stood beside her the whole ceremony, golden hair pinned up plain the way Rowena's had always been worn, and when the circuit preacher pronounced them married, it was Odessa who cried first, unguarded, entirely without performance. "I mean it properly now," she whispered to Rowena afterward, holding her hands tight. "I don't think I ever really knew you, Ro. Not until I watched you stand in that hall and take a man like Voss apart, with nothing but paper and nerve. I'm sorry it took me 23 years and 1,200 miles to finally see what was standing right beside me the whole time." "You see it now," Rowena said. "That's what matters." Odessa left 3 days later, and this time the goodbye between them was clean and simple, the ordinary ache of two people who trusted they'd see each other again rather than the hollow uncertainty of a parting neither had known how to name. The new barn stood finished by the time the first frost came, timber pale and raw against the older, weathered boards of the house, but solid, sound, built by more hands than just the two who lived there now, which felt to Rowena like exactly the right way for it to have been built. She stood in the doorway of it one evening, watching Thaddeus settle the horses for the night, the last light going gold, and long across the valley the way it always did this time of year, catching the creek water and setting it faintly, briefly, on fire with reflected color before the dark came down proper. He came to stand beside her, the way he always did now, without either of them needing to say anything about it first. The creek ran on behind them, full and clear, and entirely their own. No dam left anywhere upstream to choke it thin. The mountains had gone deep purple against a sky just beginning to show its first hard stars, and the house behind them stood lit warm and steady against the coming dark, curtains she'd sewn herself hanging bright in every window. Rowena Kane stood in the doorway of a barn built by neighbors, beside a man who had once looked at her on a train platform and said, plain and unflinching, "You're not what I expected and understood," finally, standing there with his hand warm around hers, and the whole hard, beautiful valley spread out gold and quiet before them, that being unexpected had turned out to be the truest gift either of them had ever been given. Not the useful daughter anymore, not the invisible one, sent because nobody would miss her, chosen, plainly, entirely, on her own honest terms at last, and that, she thought, watching the last light fade gentle, over land that finally, truly, felt like home, that was worth every single mile it had taken to arrive here.